I think I figured out how to do this right. Yeah, it seems like part of what the issue was recently was there's that little drop down menu that translates the video live streaming over to private or public, and its default setting for whatever reason is private. So when I go to set it to public, I hit public, but it'll drop down a menu of the three options: public, private, or unlisted. And I've been clicking right on the bar, but it doesn't acknowledge that it's changed unless you click directly on the word public. So I've been trying to set it to public and thinking that I had, only to find out later that it didn't accept that selection because I didn't click the right section of the bar that dropped down. So that's that whole mess. But anyway, moving forward, last night we were putzing around with there we go. With the idea of doing I think I got a little Nutella in my mustache. We're playing around with the idea of doing live streamed Let's Plays of tabletop games. And so I built a big old list of different games that I wanted to try to do. Now, Dragon Strike and subsequently Dragon Quest and Hero Quest all have a very similar core rule. I have Dragon Strike and Dragon Quest themed stuff that I can use. I probably will do Dragon Quest because that's the most complete set that I have. And I could do, I think they have 2 or 3 single player scenarios that I can do. And there are options of rewriting or reworking some scenarios like that. And then there's Ironsworn, which is a single player capable role-playing game. The Star Wars role-playing game magazine single player stuff is something I want to do, but with ease of getting off the ground, Mythic is a system that I can get off the ground with right away. Star Wars role-playing game, I could do the individual player, the solo play games. I kind of want to also just see if I could solo play a round of, let's see if I can pull that up actually, the Wendy's Feast of Legends, just because it's such a dorky move. Okay, so let's pull all the way down here to Wendy's Feast of Legends, open it up. Is there a single player mode? Fight against frozen beef. Queen Wendy, first of her name, breaker of fast food chains, defender of all things fresh, never frozen. I love this. Okay, so it's such a dorky thing. If you've played role-playing game, a tabletop role-playing game before, you'll find yourself quite comfortable with our setting and rules of adventure you are about to embark on. If this is your first time in the tabletop RPG world, welcome. Let us explain a little about the type of game you'll be playing. A role-playing game is, yep. After you create your character, you'll be put into a world where you make the decisions at every turn. The only limit is your imagination. Gameplay. Do they have a... Okay, so stats. Strength, intelligence, charm, arcana, grace. So is that it? Okay. Strength, intelligence, charm, arcana, and grace. Okay, so defense. Hit points are the amount of health your character has. If your hit points drop below 0, you'll pass out from hunger, and you must wait for your team to sit down for a meal before you can rejoin the adventure. Some teammates can help you stave off hunger with their special skills. This is such a dorky game idea, and that's part of the reason why I kind of like it. Battle, turns, attack, resting, cheap shot, adventuring. Buffs, debuffs, orders. The Order of the Chicken. So these are your classes. Okay. This is so stupid. I don't think there's a single solo play rule set here. But oh god, I kind of want to play this with my group of game playing friends now. It's such a dorky thing. So quick start guide. 23. Order of the French fries. Order of the Baconator fries. Oh, come on. You're being such a dork. It's beautifully dorky is what it is. Quick start guide. So it's time to pick up your D4 and roll for times. Oh, 4 times. Ooh, I found a typo. For each base stat. Yep. So yeah. It's got the stats of strength, intelligence, charm, which would be charisma. Grace, I guess, would be dexterity. Defense, maybe constitution. So strength, intelligence, charisma, dexterity, constitution. And instead of wisdom, they give you sort of arcana, which will be more like a magic system than a wisdom score. You have hit points. It's not quite a D20 system, clearly. Load, skilled with, resistance and weakness, advantage, disadvantage. And they have some pre-rolled characters that you could play with. All right, do they have a pre-roll adventure or anything? Rise from the deep freeze. Okay, so here's the adventure. Game Master intro. Let's get started. Welcome to the realm of D&D. You're in charge. Oh, so it definitely requires a Game Master. So translating, the reason I'm looking at this one is translating this over to a single player might be a little more difficult. So I may have to sideline that one till later. But with that in mind, so that leaves us more of a sense of Dragon Strike, Iron Sworn, Mythic, then potentially things like Star Wars role-playing game, Wendy's, Feast of Legends, and Alternity. So that's roughly 6 games that I could play as single-player games off the bat. Now, I do kind of want to see if I can convert some other things to single player and give a single player playthrough. And what I was looking at yesterday was looking at different versions of Dungeons and Dragons over the years. So there's essentially the first Dungeons and Dragons, and then there was Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, second edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and then third edition, 3.5, 4, and now we're in 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons when you jump on board with that. But each of those different iterations of the system had different rule sets that you could use. And so those rule sets are interesting, like the unique and different rule sets for each of the editions of the game are worth exploring and seeing how they perform in gameplay. So there are people out there who hate on the 4th edition. 4th edition had some very, very different game mechanics from what we use in 5th edition. And 5th edition is fairly different from what I was familiar with in 2nd edition. I don't think I ever got the chance to do a lot of looking into 3rd or 3.5. There was one thing I was interested in those in 3rd edition, 3.5, I think, that I was fond of. And there was a setting that I know was in 2nd edition that I was fond of. And so with that in mind, I started thinking about like some of those things I talked about doing single player games in later on. I got to wondering, well, if I'm going to be testing out the game systems of 1st through 5th edition, which of those settings that I'm interested in had a specific version of D&D they worked with. So looking back through that, I did a little looking around last night, and the 1st edition D&D used a setting, sort of a setting, and not much of a setting. Early days of D&D were not campaign world heavy. They were mainly just dungeon runs. But the 1st edition D&D, was one of its creators created a setting called Blackmore. And so 1st edition D&D Blackmore, Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, the big setting for that one was the one that I read a lot of the books for when I was younger, and it was called Dragonlance. Dragonlance has a few role-playing scenario games, adventures that you can play through that are first AD&D specific, 1st edition AD&D. And then after that, there are 2 settings that I kind of thought were interesting that happen in 2nd edition. One I've talked about, which was Dark Sun, which was a post-apocalyptic sort of Barsoom or Frank Herbert's Dune almost in a certain way. And the other setting is one called Planescape. And that one's like a reality hopping sort of so I don't know what to really compare it to. It's its own little it was spawned by trying to explain how the universe fit together for D&D. In first edition in the original Dungeons and Dragons and then Advanced Dungeons and Dragons first edition, there were things that were introduced to the campaign world over time. You know, the plane of elemental fire, the plane of elemental earth, and then you have the Shadowfell, and you had all these different planes of reality that you could travel to achieve certain effects. The astral plane. You go to the astral plane, and it's a world where thought shapes reality. And so in an effort to explain those things and the people who live in different regions of that, they were building this large-scale universal structure that they were using. And in that, Planescape ended up having to be created as a setting to play in. And so they sort of built this setting for it, and it was kind of unique. There is sort of a third one on that one, and that would be Spelljammer, which is sort of a companion to Planescapes because you're traveling through. It's essentially space travel on sailing ships with D&D races, and you can visit multiple worlds. So, I mean, those are both things I'm kind of curious about exploring, and they both take place in second edition. Now, or all three of them, I guess, technically, but third edition, that gets a little harder to find a specific for third edition. 3.5, which was a reworking of a lot of third edition's aspects, has Eberron, which was a setting that I thought was fascinating to explore. So 3.5 has Eberron, but just plain third edition, I believe the biggest piece of original for that system was something called Ptolus, which was one of the ones I talked about looking into later. So I guess I'm going to look at those. And then the fourth edition was so universally panned, and so many people refused to play it, that it didn't last long enough to do anything with. So there weren't a lot of new settings or gameplay options available for it. The best I could find was that when they built the 4th edition D&D, the basic setting used was called Points of Light or Nenterville, and it's slightly different from the rest of the universe that we're familiar with. So I guess I'll explore that as just the base core universe for 4th edition. And then 5th edition, we've had some kind of revisits. So throughout most of the history, the big time for Dungeons and Dragons was in its early days. It was sort of like DMs made their own dungeons, and there wasn't some greater overarching world structure. They did make Greyhawk and Blackmoor and eventually the Forgotten Realms that you could play in, but they were sort of add-ons. When you got to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, you had them introducing things fairly quickly. So you had Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance, and I want to say one or two other options, probably Greyhawk again, and Mystara, was one, I think. And I don't know how many of those happened in the original AD&D and how many waited for second edition, which came relatively quickly on the heels of first edition. And second edition AD&D was where you got all your extra settings. So Planescape, Spelljammer, Dark Sun, Dragonlance was adapted to second edition, and you had Greyhawk, Forgotten Realms, Mystara. I think at a certain point you had like a Middle Eastern and an Asian influenced setting that eventually got pulled in and meshed into I think Forgotten Realms or Mystara. So they made a lot of individual standalone settings that eventually just got absorbed into the larger settings. And second edition was the one where you got the most settings. When you got to third edition, I don't think they introduced a lot of new stuff. 3.5, they introduced Eberron as their new setting. And then pretty much since then, they haven't done a whole lot. There's Ravenloft is one of the sort of settings. The trick with Ravenloft is it's a demi-plane. It's not a whole universe to itself. It's sort of like one of the circles of hell, kind of. It's a place where evil beings go, and they are sort of made to be rulers over small kingdoms in a country that just sort of exists in some gap in the cosmos. And people can fall into Ravenloft and get stuck there, but it's not a world that you're necessarily. Well, I guess some of the characters, some of the people there are born there and live there. But the new 5th edition brings in most of those other settings. They haven't really readapted some of them. Like Dragonlance had I think it was a 3rd or 4th edition adaptation. Dark Sun had an adaptation to the later versions. So from from 2nd edition to I think 4th edition, they readapted Dark Sun, and so they did that for some of that, but 5th edition, they've not dragged any of that stuff in. There's no 5th edition supplements for Dragonlance, Dark Sun, or Planescapes, or Spelljammer, or any or Greyhawk for that matter, which was one of the very first settings. 5th edition almost predominantly focuses on the Forgotten Realms, which is the best known setting for that. I used to have a set of computer games called Pool of Radiance, Curse of the Azure Bonds, and a few other of those types of games, and they were all set in the Forgotten Realms. The City of Waterdeep and the Underdark and the Drow versus the Elves, those are all aspects that come from Forgotten Realms. And so looking at that, you can see some supplements for some of that, like the Forgotten Realms, definitely all over the place in 5th edition. The Ravenloft, they have a game supplement set in Ravenloft, and they've got a few other game supplements. I'm not sure what setting they're all in, but it looks like for the most part Forgotten Realms or some of the demi-planes like Ravenloft are some of them. Now, that doesn't mean other people haven't tried to adapt some of the older games like Dragonlance or Dark Sun or Planescapes or Spelljammer to 5th edition. But official materials that have been released, there is one that's unique enough. It's sort of a twist because it's not quite a fair comparison to say okay, yeah, Eberron was created for 3.5 edition of Dungeons and Dragons, and Dark Sun was created to be a Dungeons and it was originally made to be an idea for a system they were calling Battle System. But when that battle system didn't work out, they just made it into a D&D game setting. And so each one of those levels had a game or two that were specifically created for that setting or for that game system. So settings for that game system. And I think the closest we have for 5th edition for that is there was because Wizards of the Coast purchased and owns Dungeons and Dragons, Wizards of the Coast also makes Magic the Gathering. And Magic the Gathering has built its own mythology over the years. And the Magic the Gathering mythology includes a city called Ravnica. And Ravnica setting from Magic the Gathering was made into a Dungeons and Dragons setting that you could play in. And so Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica is sort of the introductory tabletop role-playing game for 5th edition. Now, that's not to say that there aren't other things. They just released Eberron translated into 5th edition recently, but Eberron, it had its start in 3.5. Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica had its start as introducing that setting to a tabletop role-playing game, not a card game, but a tabletop role-playing game in 5th edition. So I think that's probably what I'm going to end up doing in 5th edition. So all that long ramble is down to saying that we pretty much have a setting that we can play in for each of the 5, 6 versions of Dungeons and Dragons. The original Dungeons and Dragons could be playing with Blackmoor. Dragonlance would work for 1st edition Advanced Dungeons and Dragons. Planescape's Spelljammer and Dark Sun may be options for 2nd edition. Tolas could be the 3rd edition. Eberron 3.5. The Points of Light and Nadir Vale would be 4th edition for lack of something else to fill that slot. And then Guildmaster's Guide to Ravnica could be 5th edition. So we have 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 versions of Dungeons and Dragons, and we have about 9 settings that we could explore. Now, I may have to do some tinkering to get some of the solo gameplay rule sets from systems like Ironsworn and Mythic. And there is also a supplement for how to roleplay Dungeons and Dragons solo for different versions of Dungeons and Dragons. And so being able to use those rules to adapt D&D for solo play will be interesting. There, especially for base D&D, AD&D, and AD&D 2nd edition particularly, and possibly 3rd and 3.5, it's likely to be more difficult to translate them over. Like 5th edition, we can pretty clearly do it. Maybe 3rd edition, which isn't too different from 5th edition. 4th edition might be a little tricky too, because they changed so much about the system that it might make it a little more difficult to solo play. But with all of that out of the way, that's a fair amount to play with already. But prioritizing the rest of some of these ideas that I was interested in, I do think I want to jump back in at some point to play Big Eye Smallmouth. The 2 main settings that I already have are original settings for that series of games, and There are fan-based adaptations of some of my favorite anime, but I don't know if I'll count those as, you know, high priority to explore yet. Except I'm really tempted to see if there's a way to do a Ghost in the Shell themed solo role-playing game. The next in the series would be Cyberpunk 2020, which I do want to play, and the old version is Cyberpunk 2020, and I want to kind of compare it to CD Projekt Red's tabletop role-playing game that they're coming out with. And just because it's in the same theme, you could do a Shadowrun if you wanted to. After that, it really becomes a sort of like what I can get to. So Aberrant, superhero role-playing games in general. Niven's Dream Park is something I may just, when I have a chance to do a solo single game, yeah. Doctor Who, yelled by the creator of Modest Medusa. Dresden Files, Buffy Angel verse, World of Darkness series such as Mage the Ascension and Prometheus the Created, and maybe a Call of Cthulhu game. I think a lot of these are probably going to be one-shots. Now, you know, looking at like the Blackmore games for D&D might be a one-shot. The Dragonlance games probably play modules for them, so I don't know if that's going to be 1 or 2 sessions. Dark Sun, I probably think I'm going to end up doing a lot of goofing around in Dark Sun just because I love the setting so much. Tolus, I might just do a simple adventure for like introduction to the world and gameplay. Eberron, I will probably play more, like Dark Sun and Eberron, I think I probably will play a lot more in. All the others, I think, are probably going to be one-shots. Dragon Strike, I'll probably do 1 or 2 games. Iron Sworn, maybe 1 to 3 at most for that, and maybe 1 to 2 for Mythic. Star Wars role-playing game, I feel like I may want to do a lot of, and possibly Alternity. So I'm looking at the possibility here that I'm probably going to end up using up a good chunk of the year on a lot of these. So Iron Sworn I could probably revisit a little bit. I think what I'll probably end up doing with things like Iron Sworn and Mythic is finding aspects of them that I like and using them and adapting them to play in other settings. So Iron Sworn, from what I've seen, the rule sets for Iron Sworn really are built on a very, very particular type of setting. But I may want to see if I can bend those rules enough that I can make them into a different type of setting. And then Cyberpunk gaming will probably be something I do a bit of once I've gotten a little bit of that under my belt. So, and I may play around with some of the superhero stuff, but I'm hesitant to say I'll do a lot of that. And again, I want to revisit the Firefly, Farscape, Babylon 5, Men in Black, Star Trek, and those types of things. I did remember I have some books from a system called Torg that a lot of people consider like a very novel and unique setting that got bogged down in uncertainty in rule sets, and each supplement that came out on a regular basis seemed to change half the rules, and it bothered a lot of people, and so it became a real mess. But it was very innovative at the time. Thieves' World, Game of Thrones, Blades in the Dark, Exalted, Pocket Dungeon Quest. These are all things that I can probably do one-off adventures in. But I think there's probably likely to be a few that I revisit over and over again. And that's likely to be Star Wars, Dark Sun, Eberron, probably Alternity, and Cyberpunk systems. And maybe some of the Big Eyes Small Mouth stuff. That one's more likely to be that might be a little bit more of a fun one-off adventures in what I can figure out, either self-making or finding other people's creations of fan universes for my favorite Japanese animations. So like Avatar: The Last Airbender, I know it's not technically a Japanese animation. And then Cowboy Bebop, Full Metal Alchemist, maybe something in the Pokemon realm, and Ghost in the Shell in particular are things that I would love to visit and play a game or two in. And if I really get into it, do more with them. Now, I will probably have to use a system like Mythic or a reworking of Ironsworn, or maybe even adapting the Dungeons & Dragons solo play rules to the D20 based versions of those settings. So Ghost in the Shell, possibly somebody, or maybe I will have to look at the D&D solo rule sets and just see if I can convert them over to be playable. And then on top of all of that, there are my own settings and creations that I would like to visit and play and offer up bits and pieces of. And it sounds like an awful lot. It probably is an awful lot to do all of that this year. But I think it'd be fun, not only from telling stories, not only from the perspective of playing games, but also developing systems that make a game that you can play. Because a lot of the solo play systems that you use, they have basically a random event generator, which is what a lot of computer games use, because they don't have a person deciding where the story's going. You build a largely linear story with pieces of it that are generated by chance and events along the way. And so you should be able to make a computer program that can do the part of feeding you the linear story elements, and then the chance elements are run by small running programs in the background to generate certain events that happen in a certain way. And I think there's a way to make a playable computer-based game for some of these ideas. I won't know for sure how easy or how tricky that will be until we've sort of play tested some of these systems. And that's some of the fun of this too. So we're about 40 minutes in. I think that's a good place to really call it for tonight, I think. But that's sort of what I'm thinking of going forward on. Now, I think I'm going to try to come back tomorrow night, if all things work out right, and start trying to figure out the best way to do a setup to film gameplay playthroughs and system testing for games. And I have to really kind of brainstorm the best way to do that visually and interactively on YouTube here. because I want to do it on YouTube. There's a possibility of doing it on Twitch. I might look into doing that. I'm not sure what's the best option for that. I feel like a lot of people are doing those types of things on Twitch. So in a way, doing it on YouTube will mean that I have more monopoly on that topic. So anybody looking on YouTube for things like that may be more likely to come here to look into it. And then we get a greater audience to participate and play and share ideas with. But it may also be that there's just not enough people looking for that kind of content here on YouTube. So either way, I don't know which is the right option. I may dabble in trying a little bit of each. And the difference is with a setup like Twitch, it's not as user-friendly for uploading video. It's more about live streaming. And while I've done all right with some of this live streaming, some of the glitches we keep getting from this may be a problem to Twitch streaming. I think the other thing I would say about Twitch streaming is they don't have software for this. Like right now, if I want what I'm doing here on YouTube, I literally just go to my YouTube page up top and live stream video, click that button, fill in the information. I think I've got it figured out now so that it won't do any more of these private videos and I don't know it until later. That is pretty much all I have to do. I set what camera it's using and I set what audio source it's using and go. And that will get this kind of video. I can do this relatively well. I can also point the camera down to the surface that I'm working on. That's a possibility too. I have the possibility of using OBS to increase what I can do. So I could do a my face in the corner and a desktop and then some charts or screen captures off to the side of things going on, and then the chat feature on to the side of that. That's all entirely possible using OBS. I would also have to use OBS as I have no other option on Twitch. OBS would have to be some sort of streaming software. I don't think I can stream with my editing software, and they don't have a default native streaming software on Twitch. You have to use a third-party program to do it. At least that's what it looked like the last time I looked at it. And that's less dependable, but it also offers me a few more options in what I can do. But I can do all of that same stuff using YouTube. I haven't figured out if Facebook is worth it. Facebook has been doing some video stuff lately, so I might look into some of that in the future. But for now, that is sort of my thoughts on it. I will give a little more detailed breakdown of what I think may be the best way to do these videos tomorrow. And then I'm hoping that within a reasonable amount of time, I may be able to do my first round of playtesting stuff. And I need to get back on the saddle of reviewing movies and books and stuff like that, because while I haven't filmed the reviews and stuff, and I haven't uploaded anything, I have read books, I have watched movies, I have played games, and I have thoughts to share on them. So I should probably get on that, huh? All right. So thanks for joining me for tonight. I will catch you tomorrow, theoretically, and take care and have a good night. Suddenly very warm in here. I might be coming down with something, but we'll find out. That doesn't mean, just because I'm sick doesn't mean I can't upload a video. Hope you're doing well.